Welcome to the Cult Kid podcast, where I pretty much have conversations with myself. Take that how you will. I'm Durs. And I've basically been wanting to tell my story in a way from a perspective of talking about things that I feel like talking about. And I sat down the other day to do episode 2 and found myself an hour later just rambling and listening back to it. It was quite boring. And so I was thinking about it, and what I realized was that there's these things that I really want to talk about, and I think I was creating some sort of excuse to postpone talking about it because I think I'm nervous and a little bit scared to really put how I think and what I think and believe out there. And I don't know why, but it doesn't really matter. And so I realized that I just need to pay attention to that feeling and move towards it. And so I figured I would just start talking about what it is I want to talk about, and probably through this process, the peculiarities of my upbringing and growing up in the cult will probably come up and whatnot. So, without further ado, I want to talk about Jordan Peterson. A lot of people don't like him. A lot of people do like him. And I feel like I want to talk about things from a perspective of how I come to my conclusion. And that's because what I've noticed, especially with myself, which is the crux of why I am doing this, is I've noticed that for me, the past few years, longer than that, since my whole life, and maybe that's the whole thing, is like I've always been told what to believe, told how to believe it, what to think, how to think. And getting out of the cult, looking back, once I got out, I pretty much jumped into the same sort of uh, like lack of self-thought. I pretty much, I would see something and believe it and buy into it and never do any real kind of research and figuring out like what does it mean to me. And fast forward several years to now, and especially the last few months, I've really just been able to pay attention to like the things that I'm kind of told to believe, and then I've started questioning like why do I think this thing and why do I believe this? And when I think back and try to figure it out, I realize I have no context. I have no really substantial information for why I believe what I believe. Like the only thing I can come up with is I heard somebody say it one time and I saw somewhere on the internet that said this, and that's the extent of the information that I have. And so, to put it simply, my beliefs and the way I think is at this point has been completely uninformed. And I want to talk about Jordan Peterson because for me, and for me, I found Jordan Peterson at a pivotal moment in my life. And from my perspective, he says things that really help me as an individual. And yeah, and this because I've been going through the past few years, really figuring out like what's going on with me emotionally, what's going on with me mentally, and you know, without getting sidetracked and going down a rabbit hole of all of that and growing up in the cult, it's all subjective to growing up in the cult. I was told, believe this, this is what you should believe, here's how you should think, and I never questioned it. And then there's the naivete and the innocence of being so sheltered that brought me through a whole lot of experiences through my early 20s, which led to drinking, drugs, drinking to cope, which led to being more or less addicted. Not extremely. I was more of a functioning alcoholic, but there was a point where, I was drinking beer for breakfast, going to class or school or work, beer for lunch, beer on break, get home, and then beers to relax until I went to bed. And marijuana, of course, to block out all the thoughts or whatever. But and in doing that, that kind of led me to where everything kind of started culminating. And the past few years, there was two moments really specifically that really kind of woke me up to this this situation that I was in and got me to realize, oh, there's something really seriously going on with me. I need help. And um, I don't really know. uh, I don't really know if my extended family were to even watch this, what they would think about this, but it's my experience. And so I noticed at one point that it was being around extended family that triggered me. And it's not because they're bad people, not because they say mean things to me. It's just there's this, I'm self-diagnosed, like hypersensitive. I feel things, I feel the emotions of people. I've come to understand this about myself, and there's been a whole lot of work in creating the boundaries on my own personality with all of that. But the 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 energy of the religiosity and the dogmatic ideology surrounding all of that, it, it takes me back to how I grew up, and the whole, I guess, perspective in my mind is that I went through all of these situations in my early 20s that really, really uh, hurt me psychologically, emotionally, mentally, because I was ingrained in this religious upbringing, just like narrow, tight, never, and because of that, there was an extreme naivety and innocence about me that I didn't know anything about reality and how it worked, and found myself in a lot of situations that were not fun. And so that was one moment. And there was another moment. I was in yoga school to get my certification and went through a whole 9 months. It was literally the last weekend. I had a few hours left of class. And just all of a sudden, I I can only assume it was a panic attack. It's never happened to me before, and it hasn't happened to me since then. But all I knew to do, all I could do, was remove myself from the situation. And I went and walked around the block several times, and then tried to go back into class, and just was not happening. And I remember that weekend, having a depressive episode. And it was one of those situations where, and I've never I've never been this depressed before, but that weekend, I And it sounds trivial to say, but like I could not get out of bed. I couldn't bring myself to get up and go to class. It was unbearable. It was just like beyond anything that I thought I could experience or handle. And it was kind of a culmination of these two moments, and then and realizing, okay, like I need to figure this out because it wasn't getting better. You know, the drinking, wasn't getting better. I wasn't able to control it. I had for so many, like for 8 years probably, that I had always tried to do like sober October or dry January, like go 30 days sober. And I couldn't. I literally, I just couldn't. And I would get like 2 weeks in was the longest I ever got. And I think it was quite literally my body was chemically dependent on it. And getting to that point into after like the second week, it was like, I, there was no concept of saying no. It was a necessary, it was a necessity. I needed it. Um, and that was I used drinking to suppress my feelings and smoking weed to put the thoughts away. And so I began looking for a therapist, and this was this year, like maybe April, July. And it was also around the time, this was around the time, so no, let me backtrack. A year ago, September, not last September, a few months ago, but the year before that, I was finally able to make it a whole month sober. And that really, really changed my psychology. I was able to attribute good feelings and thoughts to being sober, which I think helped pull me out of, to where I am now. And I feel really good and confident about it now, even though I know that it's always a battle. I always have to say no, and it, if I let myself enjoy it, it ends up, it's like a slippery slope. It just goes off. But I've been doing really well. I'm super proud of myself. I feel good. And the point I'm trying to make is that in that month, I felt the most clear-headed that I've honestly ever felt. I don't know if I can say that I was clear-headed before I started drinking and drugging. Um, there's quite a seamless transition between leaving the cult and, eh, so to speak, taking a swan dive into all the pleasures of the world that I was told was wicked and wrong and sinful. So there was no gap. There was no experiencing life, reality as a sober person. It was, I'm sober in the cult, and I experienced life from a drug-filled, alcohol-filled perspective, which I'm sure added to the conglomeration. Is that the right word? Of of just disconnected feelings and thoughts that I was having, down the road. Um, so that happened, and within that month, that's when I, kind of had these thoughts of like, I want to do a podcast. I've always thought it would be cool, and so in my clear-headedness, I just started doing it. And what I noticed is that getting things out of off my chest and expressing things, and they're the previous episodes are cringeworthy, in my opinion. I don't even go back and listen to them. I don't want to, but they're still there if you are curious. Um, and so I say that to say that like the clear-headedness part, being able to like, make something happen or at least move forward with something was there. And so, you know, move forward to 6 months later, and uh, I had started following, because of that month, and I've always been this way where I want to do something, to be doing something, to like elevate myself, and just like I don't know what you would call it, but like mm, I don't know if it's a conscientious personality for, you know, reaching for bigger, better things. And, part of that was like, I want to make more money. I want to set myself up for success later on in life. And then I don't think I really had a concept of what it meant to make myself better, be better, except to figure out the shit that's going on inside me. And so I found I was on Instagram and I found some of these motivational uh, profiles. They would say things like, "Yeah, just get up and go to the gym," or "Do you give whatever it is, some sort of inspirational quote or whatever." And it was at that point that I think a video of Jordan Peterson popped up, and it was probably something along the lines of like young men should figure out how to be a monster and then learn how to control it. And that kind of stuck with me, and I really liked that. And then I figured out who this man was and started following him and listening to a few lectures, and I really, really enjoyed the perspective he had and how he explained things and the way he talks. And he's a psychologist, and I love psychology and learning about the mind and whatnot. And so move forward. I want to add into that at the same time, these a couple people showed up on my feed, and one was this guy named Kevin. Kevin, I had it somewhere. Kevin, I don't remember, but I think on Instagram it's the Red Pill, but the other one was Andrew Tate. And at some point, I remember somehow coming to the conclusion that both of these people were misogynistic and I didn't need to have any part in what they were saying. And so then I unfollowed the accounts that were posting things about them. And that was that. It was like in my brain, they were misogynistic, whatever. And I disregarded anything else that they had to say. At that point, I had not seen any kind of controversy on Jordan Peterson. So I'm I'm following Jordan Peterson. I bought his book 12 Rules for Life, which was awesome and very simple read, and it's a self-help book. It's the same thing that every self-help book talks about, just from a different perspective. And at some point at work, I remember just it was kind of in passing, and I heard somebody say something like about Jordan Peterson, fuck that guy. And that struck me. It's like what I've known about Jordan Peterson was nothing nothing that would require me to say fuck that guy. And so I quickly asked, like, well, why'd you say that? Like, what? He's like, oh, the dude's misogynistic and transphobic. And that struck me because I'm not one to just like write off what anybody says. I understand that I don't know everything and I don't have all the information. So maybe there's something that, he knows that I don't. So I go home and I start to like look it up. Like, and how do I look that up? I just Google Jordan Peterson, transphobic. And what I came to realize is that um, basically what the thought was that or the assumption was that he refused to refer to a transgender person with their preferred pronouns. And in my mind, it didn't really make sense because I had been following him for so long and I read his book, and it's just the personality, like it didn't match. And so I looked into it, and apparently, and the story goes that and he's from Canada, so he's a psychologist and professor in a Canadian university, Toronto, I think. Apparently, the Canadian government was putting forward a bill that was compelling speech. And I think so many years later at this point, it's changed whatever the situation was. Jordan Peterson's read of it was, and that and he even says himself, like if somebody comes up to him and says these are the pronouns I prefer to be referred to as, he would respect it and refer to them how they wish to be referred to. But the problem that he had was that the government was compelling him to use specific speech, and in his mind, which I agree with, is wrong. I don't think the government should be telling individuals what they can and cannot say. And um, if and after and this has been 6 months. So at this point, I've heard far more things Jordan Peterson said. I've listened to more podcasts and lectures, and I know now that Jordan Peterson um, studied totalitarianism, authoritarianism in the 20th century. And one of the first steps that happens towards the totalitarian end of like Maoist China, when millions of people died under the author or under the totalitarian rule, is the state or government begins to try and control and take linguistic power. And so when he saw this, that's the perspective he's coming from. And it's not that he, at least from the way that I read it, in my perspective, like he's not anti-trans, he's just anti-government telling him what he can and cannot say. And so I read that, and I, okay, shrugged off whatever the guy said at work. And through this time, about this time, I think I had found the therapist that I was going to last, which it was a serendipitous meeting, and after several therapists, I kind of figured out how to look for a therapist that would match my personality. And um, it was it was a meeting that was meant to be. And so that's neither here nor there. But through this time, I noticed that my ideologies and what I thought was changing, and it was definitely a little bit different than what most people that I was associated with were thinking and feeling. And I I felt like I couldn't say what I was thinking and feeling. Finding this information about Jordan Peterson, like it didn't feel like it was my duty to go up to the person I heard say "fuck Jordan Peterson, he's transphobic," and explain to him why he's not, and why, and this was all at work. So in the context of work, like, do I really want to even bring that up and then make it awkward? And what's gonna like? There's just all these things, and so that was a struggle that I was having, and that kind of relates to the podcast and doing this. I think it gives me a opportunity to really personally work through these different thoughts and differentiating beliefs and figure out for myself and come to my own conclusion, figure out my own opinion on the matter. And um and 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 so that was that. And working through therapy, it was beautiful, and it really started to help, and realized that I didn't have to always say anything, and I could keep thoughts to myself, but at the same time I didn't have that camaraderie where I could just talk how I felt and whatnot. And so I always kept my mouth shut. But then it came up. I found my opportunity. It came up at another point at work, and one of my friends, uh, we were talking about dating, and she was like, "There's three things a guy needs to have when I date him," and yeah, the first two were normal, like money and good hygiene, and the third one, she said, he needs to hate Jordan Peterson. And I was like, "What?" Like, and so at that point, I said, "Well, whoa, like pause. Like, what's wrong with Jordan Peterson?" And she came back at me with, "Oh, he's misogynistic. He's a charlatan." I was like, "He's a fake. He's a fraud, and he hates women. Like, what? That doesn't make sense." But again, I don't have the information that they might have, and I understand information bias. So all I have is the information that feeds whatever it is that I feel, and it coincides with my feelings that I have and the things that I'm thinking already. I wasn't looking for any information outside of that. So I understood that maybe there was other information. So, having a conversation in that little moment, I quickly realized that they had never actually read any of his books, listened to any of his lectures. So in that context, I knew that they didn't have the information that I had. But still, I thought it prudent to go home and Google Jordan Peterson charlatan. And I tried to find the articles again, but I couldn't find them. All I remember is I'm pretty sure it was like Huffington Post or something like that. And in the articles, they were making these claims saying misogynistic and charlatan, but if it was cited to another article on the same website by another or the same person making the opinion. And I also noticed that these articles and things they were saying were sensationalized and basically geared towards a like specific rhetoric. It was like, here's how I feel. I want you to feel this way too. And the other article, it was some lady explaining some psychological concept, which was really confusing and drawn out, and basically saying that Jordan Peterson doesn't know what he's talking about. So then I found that interesting, and well, who is this? And so I went and looked up the person that did the writing of the article and realized she's a pianist and she writes on the side, which immediately in my mind, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. So I basically disregarded all of that, and no, I don't think Jordan Peterson's a charlatan, and I don't think he's a misogynist. And it's really, really, really curious. Is it Kathy Newman? I should have found gotten the specific name, but there's an interview that happened several years ago with Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman, I think is the name, a British TV personality, news anchor person, where it's super interesting to watch because they really get into the gender pay gap and a bunch of different things. And if watching that video might be triggering for some, but it's really eye-opening too at the same time. And even watching that, you realize like Jordan Peterson doesn't hate women. He just has a very scientifically backed psychological perspective, social perspective on, and an understanding of how research and studies are done in specific situations and whatnot. And I'm not going to get into it, but it was a very curious thing. But it showed me that no, he's not misogynistic, and he's not a fake. He's not a fraud. And so I wrote that off, and I wanted to say that because for myself, when I try to figure something out, there's a couple rules right there that I like to follow. And one is when I'm reading an article and then they cite their article with their own articles and it takes you to another page, an article on their own website, and there's never any really like substantial sightings outside of their viewpoint. And this works for me. I might be wrong, but it helps me work through what I perceive to be bullshit rather quickly, and I write it off. And then the same thing is like I will look up who wrote the article and basically vet them and see if what their experience is, what their profession is. Do they actually have the knowledge of what they're talking about? And the other thing is too is like if something's sensationalized, if something gets you worked up, if the way it's worded and it gets you worked up and it's in a sense reinforcing you or guiding you to a very specific conclusion, then I also write it off, and it's unsubstantial, not important. And so that's been my experience with Jordan Peterson and having a personal experience with hearing his lectures and hearing what he says, and it's things that really, really helped me personally, and it gives me a way to look and move through reality that I had never learned before. Because growing up in the cult, everything was from such a narrow-minded, very specific perspective, and how the world actually works was never discussed. I was never taught. It was always people are going to hell, and your job as a Christian is to witness to them and bring them into the fold and show them the love of Jesus. And so, and there are things that my parents instilled in me, and they taught me how to be a good person. They taught me how to be kind. Um, as a young boy growing up, I did learn how to work, and I know how to work hard, and I personally am confident in my work ethic. But when it comes to the reality of society and how it works and how we interplay off of each other, I have zero context for it. And and that's another way in which, when I got out of the cult, it just kind of added to, like, it was this compounding effect of just to put it simply, a naivete and an innocence, and couple that with a deep-seated anger towards what I had been taught and how I grew up, because I really, really felt like I had been lied to for my whole life. And in that regard, I also developed a deep-seated distrust for everyone, and compound that with moving through the experiences of my reality so naive and innocent, finding myself in situations that I didn't even understand what was going on. I just knew that it didn't feel good, and then feeling so, like, emotionally hurt and mentally fucked with, to put it simply. Just kind of like all of these things were compounding, and so when I find somebody like Jordan Peterson, who, from a psychological perspective, because I love psychology. If I had a different path, I probably would have gone into, and I actually thought about going into studying psychology, but you got to go to school 8 years before you can utilize that degree. So I don't love school that much. Let's be real here. But I mean, ever since I was 22, I've been reading Carl Jung, and I love his perspective about self-actualization and symbols within the collective unconscious, and those things and those topics blow my mind, and I love them. And Jordan Peterson also has an affiliation and affinity for Carl Jung, and so when I come across Jordan Peterson and I listen to his lectures, and they're all about just simply be a man. And it's not even necessarily like be a man. He speaks to everyone, but I'm a man, so I take it as a man. But be a man and do what you need to do. Speak your truth. Get up in the morning and do the hard thing. It's and in it there's it's just it's very, very, very helpful and practical to me to be able to listen to these countless hours of free lectures on YouTube. And to on that note, and I haven't gotten into this yet, but in this will be another episode, I know, in the future, but there's something about religion, and specifically Christianity for me, because that's how I grew up, that is changing, or at least there's an alternate perspective of it that is coming to light. And I know right now, I think Jordan Peterson, one of his series is on Exodus, and the way that he interprets the Bible and Genesis and the Old Testament and stuff is, um I can't give detail because I haven't started listening to it, but the little snippets I've seen are eye-opening, and it gives it gives a way for me to relate to this ingrained ideology in my mind without hating it or trying to subjugate it and shove it down, but it gives me a way to relate to it in a way that I can utilize it and be practical in a way that would help my psychology, mentality, and live a life of decency and goodness. And so when it comes down to Jordan Peterson, is he malevolent or benevolent? I truly believe, and it's my opinion, and you might think differently, but I believe that Jordan Peterson is benevolent and that we shouldn't disregard the things that he's saying just because we don't like it on the surface. I really feel and truly believe that the things he is saying are coming from a place of love and kindness and a place of recognizing psychologically and socially what's happening in society right now. And I feel like that's why he's been saying what the things that he's saying, because and as I go through these topics, there's this underlying theme that I can't quite articulate yet, but I'm starting to see it kind of come together in a strange way. But there is something going on. And I don't know if it's just the simplest way to put it is a paradigm shift. And we're kind of in that middle stage where things are confusing and there's different thoughts. And, at some point, it's going to even out and we'll find a way through it and come out on the other side stronger. Or if I don't know. But there's something happening and it borders on the line of conspiratorial, although I know there's a way to explain it without being conspiratorial, but there you have it. That's that. So Jordan Peterson, not malevolent, he's benevolent, and I appreciate what he says and his lectures and the things that he does. And so, love me or hate me, I'm Durs, your cult kid, and that was a rather extensive conversation with myself. I love you all. See you next time. Goodbye.